All right, so we're back with another episode, but this week's video is going to be a little bit different than the previous two, and that's because we're going to be focusing a lot more on the compositional aspect of music production. So I hope that you're excited for that, and I also hope that this video finds you well. We're going to be learning how to compose percussive slash stomp music for action scenes, or even possibly sports or sports related commercials. So you can find some of that in there, but this piece in particular kind of falls in between the different subgenres of percussive music, meaning there are some genres of percussive music that are more cinematic and orchestral, which you see in like typical action scenes, just the big drums and the big impacts and the explosiveness. And there are more like, I guess, simplistic percussive tracks, which you could see in just like an Adidas commercial, something like that. But this one falls in between, and it actually has kind of an ethnic, almost African vibe. So I envision this being placed in a scene where, this is what I saw in my mind when I was composing this. So you have like a group of Native Americans maybe, and they're in the jungle and they're hunting some sort of animal, and it's intense, like it's the hunt. So that's the vibe I was going for this track, and I encourage you to start visualizing things like this when you're composing, because especially when it comes to TV and film music, you're going to want to have some sort of a concept that you're working with. So it has to be very clear in your mind, and the music that you create will hopefully in due time, as you get better and better, start reflecting what you see in your mind. And that's just going to make it easier for you to sell your music and to pitch it, because if it doesn't have any vibe and you don't have some sort of a story to sell, it's going to be very difficult to get your music placed. It cannot just be, in the case of percussive music, it cannot just be a groove. It has to be a groove that expresses some sort of image or imagery. So that's just something I wanted to bring up before starting. But other than that, we're just going to be talking for the rest of the video. There's going to be a lot more information this time, but hopefully the video will be a bit shorter. So I hope you got your notepad ready, because we're jumping right into the listening. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to quickly go over the different instruments I use to create this track and where you can find these sounds. So as it turns out, everything in this project was created using Composer Cloud, which is a subscription service offered by East West Sounds, which gives you access to like more sample libraries than you'll know what to do with. So if you had one instrument to choose from, it would have to be Composer Cloud. You can create entire tracks more complex than this just using that one service. So I highly recommend checking that out if you haven't. I've only been bringing it up for the past 2 videos, so it's definitely something that you need in your tool belt if you're doing music for TV and film. So if we're talking about the percussion and the cymbal section, everything you can find in either Storm Drum 2 or Storm Drum 3. So these are just the staple, I guess, percussive libraries where you'll find 99% of the sounds you're going to be using for percussion. From ethnic drums to like big drums to just everything you need to create percussion in a cinematic context and beyond. So most of the stuff I use for this project I got from Storm Drum 3. And I also like starting with Storm Drum 3 specifically because it categorizes things nicely, and the fact that it categorizes things into big drums and small drums really makes it easy to start building a track or sketching a track quickly. So you'd have your big drums as the foundation at the bottom, as the foundational layer, and then you have small drums in the middle to kind of like as your mid kind of like treble frequency instruments, and then you can kind of like close it off with either some shakers or cymbals, medals, and that's how you would close off this metaphorical sandwich that we're building. So even if you don't have any specific sounds in mind, you could already get a pretty good idea of what you want to create just by sketching something quickly using this method. But to be honest, I think I spent like maybe, it must have been more than 2 hours just auditioning each and every single sound and just seeing which sounds would be best for this project. Because when we're talking about percussion, it's not as simple as working with strings or brass, which, a string section sounds like a string section, like a violin sounds like a violin, even if it has different articulations. It's still just a violin. But when we're talking about percussion, there's just so many different options and nuances and colors you can choose from, especially when you have like libraries like this. Like, just look how much selection you have, so that's something you should dedicate at least an hour or two to, and maybe start creating some playlists, which you can do in the Play Engine. See, I got 3 of them created right over here to just make your job easier, moving forward, because you're going to want to save some time with this, because you're not always going to have time to, go shopping, for sounds and like, just take your time. Like, you might have to do something pretty quickly. So you want to have access to the sounds you're looking for and just start, categorizing things. And, I don't know, maybe you could categorize them by country of origin, or you can categorize them by, are they like a low frequency? Are they kind of like bass drum kind of sounds, or resemble a bass drum? Could they be used as a substitute for that? Or are they more like a snare sounding thing? Like, for example, a djembe could be kind of like a replacement for a snare. Kind of sounds, it's basically like an African snare. So you can have like kind of a playlist for that. But yeah, so I just definitely recommend doing that, because that's a big part of composing percussive music, is just getting the right sounds, because there are a lot to choose from. But worst comes to worst, just make a choice. So that takes care of percussion. Another percussive element that I added to this track is actually a vocal percussive element, which is the shouts from the men's choir. And this comes from Hollywood choirs. It's the only patch, sadly, that has shouts, but it definitely did the job. If you were looking for more though, and you weren't sure where to find it, you can actually do a search in the database, which goes through the entire Composer Cloud catalog. So even if you don't have a library installed, you can search for shouts, and like let's say you click on it and you don't have it installed, it will tell you which library you have to install to have access to this sound. So that's really useful if you're just getting started with this service and you don't know which libraries to download. I mean, you have a pretty good idea from what I'm working with, but I mean, if you just, because there are a lot more than what I'm showing you guys, so this is just a good way to find the sounds that you're looking for, but if you have a specific idea of what it is you're looking for. And if I'm not mistaken, these other shouts are going to be coming from symphonic choirs, not Hollywood choirs. So that's another library I've been meaning to install, just to have access to those. As far as sound design, which I did for this, I just added one little element, which is that low frequency kind of sub thing that you're hearing. And that's from, once again, it's from Storm Drum 2, and it's in Sound Design Percussion, and you have ambient largeness right there. So that would be this one. So that's just something to consider, especially when you're making music for TV and film. You want to just sometimes have that extra touch of cinematic magic. So that's how you go about doing it. This is a really good folder with just sounds you can use to augment the quality of your production. So that pretty much covers the selection process of sounds. And now we're going to talk a little bit more about how you would go about starting a track like this, and how you would, especially in the context of percussion, because it needs to sound realistic, right? So how do we make it sound realistic? So that's what we're going to be talking about right now. All right, so if you were going to start a percussive track like this, or just any track in general, there are basically two approaches that, well, from what I can tell, that you can employ. I mean, one of them is a more vertical approach, which just involves layering different parts, like in a loop. So you can work with an 8-bar loop and just start layering different sounds together. Maybe you have like, your entire, like all of these sounds, you find a way to like layer them into an 8-bar loop, and it might sound like a bit crowded at some point, but you're just basically creating kind of like if we compare this to sculpting, it's kind of like you're just adding clay, and you just keep adding clay. You're building mass, so then you can sculpt with it later, and then that's when you end up like stretching it out horizontally. So that's the approach I personally used for this track. But there's also another approach, which is maybe you can just pick one part, which is a little bit more difficult to do with percussion. Like if you had maybe like an acoustic guitar part, and you're just able to strum the entire piece, like let's say it's 2 minutes, for 2 minutes you just create the entire structure using one instrument, and then you just kind of like build up the layers that way. That's another way you can approach music composition or music production. But ideally, at some point or another, you have to find a balance between those two methods. So it has to be a combination of, and it, regardless of what you're working with, it will be, even if you're working with an 8-bar loop, there is still a horizontal approach to that. Like if you're making an 8-bar phrase, for example, it's not, it's still, it's like kind of like a sentence. So the difference between creating one sentence at a time or creating the entire paragraph in one shot. So ideally, when you get really good, you'll be able to just create a paragraph in one shot, but maybe at first you'll have to work sentence by sentence, which is fine. And either way, at some point you're going to have to focus on one sentence at a time to build it up that way. So the idea is just to have a balance between those two, to just have a combination of harmonic vertical thinking and melodic horizontal thinking. But for a percussive piece like this, it's just much easier to you just create yourself like an 8-bar loop or a 4-bar loop. It just depends on how specific you want to get. Like, let's say you just start with this and you just start layering the parts. You just start with like you do one of the parts. So let's say you're just starting with a, kind of like the bass drum, like the foundation, and maybe that's just doing quarter notes. So you just lay that down, and then you add a part on top of that, and then another part on top of that, and you just start layering it until it sounds like it's ready to be expanded. And then once you have that piece of critical mass, that's when you start arranging. So the next step in the compositional process will be arranging, and that's just creating a form, the different sections that you're going to be working in, and just, like what parts are being played when, and like you can start seeing it. It's kind of like you're sculpting. You see like the little chisels here and there, and how this part is only over here and not anywhere else in the track, and how you have like this little hole over here. And these are just like the different decisions that I made arranging this piece of music. And that's what you got to do. And like the fact that I added choirs, but only like in the second part of the track. So these are all decisions you have to make, and this is how you kind of creating a story. This is how your story develops. It's not just by looping the same thing over and over again, which would be pretty problematic in this context. You have to have something changing every 4 to 8 bars. It has to evolve. Like your piece cannot be repetitive. And if you're going to repeat a section, it has to be different somehow each time. And I know that's a very difficult challenge when you're working with just percussive music, because it's very easy to get it to sound kind of repetitive and loopy. So this is just a really good exercise, actually, because if you can do it with percussive music, make it sound really dynamic and, just like a story, then you can apply that to everything else, and it'll be much easier, especially when you're working with other instruments. So that's something you want to consider when making this kind of music, is just focusing on not making it sound repetitive and loopy. But other than that, the other thing I want to talk about is just the fact that there is just no way you're going to get this to sound realistic if you're programming your parts. Like if all your MIDI notes, they're the same velocity, or even if you spend hours, like just making them sound all different and just kind of programming your notes, like it will take you so much time to do that, and the results will not nearly be as good as if you just performed the parts yourself using a MIDI keyboard, or at the very least some sort of control surface. So that is like a huge element in this kind of, especially for percussive music. I mean, you can get away with it with like synths and drum machines and stuff, but like when you're working with sample libraries, your rule should be to just always perform your parts with a keyboard. And the thing is, you can always edit your performance later. It's much easier to edit a performance than it is to draw one up from scratch using, the pencil tool in the MIDI sequencer. So that's just it's gonna save you time, and it's gonna make your music sound realistic. So I always perform my parts. So regardless, like I'm always playing them on the keyboard, and even if they're not perfect, you can just quantize, you can just, you can edit the MIDI notes manually afterwards. But that's the advantage of working with MIDI, actually, is that you can do that. If it was an audio thing, then you would have much less flexibility afterwards. You would have to get it right the first time, and that's pretty much it. So that's definitely something you're going to want to consider, is to do, perform your parts. And if you're not doing that already, like just the sooner you start, the better, because if you just wait too long, then you'll almost be handicapping yourself going down the line. So you don't want to put yourself in that position. Now the thing is, with these sample libraries, and you're gonna discover this for yourself. The one thought that I've always had is that, man, it would just be so much easier if I just had the real instrument and I just played it, because it would be a lot easier, actually, because it's the real instrument, it's there. But now you're kind of accessing these sounds through a keyboard, and the way they're organized, like each instrument, like it's kind of like its own thing. It's kind of like you're learning a new instrument each time, because of the way that the manufacturer of the sample library organize the samples. Although East West kind of has a certain logic to the way they do things in Composer Cloud, so you'll kind of start understanding after a couple of instruments how how they're organized. But for the most part, you just got to use your ears and just treat each instrument as a new instrument that you're learning. Even though you're playing it through the keyboard, which is the same instrument, just pretend like you're learning a new instrument each time. It'll get you into that mindset where you got to really adapt to every new sound library that you're working with. So you just got to practice. So if let's say that it's your first time working with the Surdos, and specifically the Composer Cloud Surdos, well, just spend some time just practicing, coming up with some parts. And it's the same thing as performing like a drum kit part. Although drum kits, it's mapped, it's very clear how it's mapped. Like I know where the kick drum is, I know where the snare is, I know where the hi-hat is. It's very easy to orient yourself. But this, you just really got to use your ears and just kind of get into it and learn the instrument. So there's just no shortcut to this. And I mean, if you can see, like in the background, there's a pair of congas there, and I actually bought those congas because I was sick and tired of having to learn how to translate congas using a MIDI keyboard. But as I learned down the line, like I love those congas, like performing on them, and I've actually recorded some tracks with them, and it is easier. Like it's a lot more intuitive. But like that might be a thought that you have, is just I just need to start buying a bunch of instruments, and just that's great if you can afford it. But I mean, if you just commit and you just spend like 1 hour or like even half an hour just figuring out some parts using that sample library and how you're performing it on the keyboard, you're just you're gonna realize that the more of them you work with, eventually it just becomes it does become intuitive, like playing a real instrument. So you're not gonna have to think about it so much. You're just gonna use your ears, and you're gonna develop almost like a reflex to using these sample libraries. That just comes with time though, but it will be frustrating at first. So just get used to that, but definitely start performing your parts. There's just no way that you're gonna have tracks sounding like this if you're programming notes one by one. So that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about in regards to composition. Like that's my little rant of the day, or of the week. It's just basically it's just important to perform your parts. You need to consider how you're going to be starting your track, if you're going to start with more of a horizontal approach or more of a vertical approach. And yeah, you just gotta have to start learning how to use your sample libraries. It's not a shortcut. Like a sample library is like an instrument in its own. So just start learning to adapt to the situation, and it will only get easier as the years and weeks go by. Okay, so instead of going over the mixing and mastering process for this video, I'm actually going to be pointing you guys to last week's video and to the video before that. The link to those videos are going to be in the description box. And the reason I'm doing this is because I just don't want to bore you guys by repeating the same thing over and over again. Like this week's project has nothing outstanding in regards to mixing and mastering. It's pretty much the same thing as the previous 2 weeks. If there was anything exceptional, I'd go over it, but there's just nothing, it's not worth going over in this video. Like you could just check out last week's episode and you'll understand how I mix and master these tracks, how I go about doing that. But if you do have any particular questions in regards to that, just leave them down in the comments, and I'm always happy to make a video dedicated to, let's say you want to know more about compression, or you want to know like more about mastering, and doing it quickly, doing it effectively for this kind of work. Just leave me a comment and we'll make a video dedicated to that topic. Other than that, I hope that you enjoyed this week's episode. It was a little bit different than the previous two. That's just because I'm trying to keep things fresh. I'm trying to keep things interesting for you guys. And starting next week, the videos are going to be a little bit more interactive and integrated. And what I mean by that is that if you notice, like it seems like I've been separating the listening portions or the audio portion from me talking. Like I don't, let's say I talk about something, you might be asking yourself, why isn't he just like making us listen to it right now? And that's just because the computer I'm using right now has some limitations, especially when I'm combining running a really heavy logic session like this with the screen capturing. Like it just, the computer cannot handle it. So that's why I decided to purchase a new computer, and starting next week, I will be using that, and it will be much easier for me to make the experience more integrated and like one. So the audio and me talking is going to be a lot more interactive, and I hope that the videos are going to be better because of that. But other than that, if you're getting a lot of value out of these videos, and if you haven't done so already, I definitely recommend subscribing to the channel. We release new educational content like this every week, and we also release 2 other pieces of either promotional content or just, you know, something that we do at Decibel Peak. So whether it's the music that we create or mock-ups that we do, it'd definitely be interesting for you guys to see that, because this is ideally what you should be doing if you want to have or maximize your success in the music industry, and more specifically in the sync licensing industry. So I thank you for your time, and we'll see you in the next video.